G'day everyone, Kate from the Narrate team here. What happens when you fail to live up to the desires and goals you have for yourself? What does it mean to live day to day, knowing that we all fall short of our own standards? What other option does Jesus bring to the table? Today, Adam considers these questions as we continue in the series, The Goat Has Left the Building.
This morning we are going to jump back into that conversation that we started on Easter called The Goat Has Left the Building. And I think maybe the best way to start would be to just get you thinking about the last time you tanked. Like not got tanked, not that type of tank, but like when was the last time you completely failed to live up to your own expectations for yourself? Not even, maybe you're like not even a God person or a God-fearing person or a Christian person or whatever, like not God's expectations of you, not your parents' expectations of you, but when's the last time like you just failed to live into the identity that you want to have, to live out? Because this is what we do, right? Like I think of elementary school and you would trace somebody on a white sheet of paper, you'd trace yourself and kind of stand it up and then it'd be an art project. As you're an adult, it means you're dead. When you're a kid, it's an art project. You know what I mean? Like that's what we do, is sometimes for worse, but it's also part of being human. Like we are constructing identities that we then project to our coworkers and our friends, and part of what makes marriage so difficult is it's hard to project for very much longer. Like that's what we do. So when's the last time you didn't live up to the identity that you really wanted to live? Think about that, will you? I was thinking about it this week, and as a son-in-law, I'm batting about $1.25. Some of you can relate, and if you're a baseball person, like you know, $1.25 means you play for the Cardinals right now, or you're a pitcher. But in any case, that's a joke because the Cardinals can't hit right now, and like 3 of you follow baseball, and the rest of you follow lacrosse, so whatever. But it means that you don't get off the bench very often. And we've talked in the past about my kind of long storied track record of being a pathetic son-in-law, and it's very literal. And it has nothing to do with them. That's what makes it hurt so much, right? Like they're great people. They're even deaf, so they can't even like say things that hurt me. I mean, it's a pretty great relationship. They're incredible people. I'm the village idiot. And so this winter, my wife had told me that they were going to come for 2 nights, and that they were going to get here on Sunday afternoon and they were going to leave on Tuesday morning. Now, for me, Sunday afternoon through Monday into Tuesday, like that's my wheelhouse. That's my least stress, walk away from here, brain's kind of clear, a little bit tired but clear. Monday's my day off, so I'm going, sweet, like I am going to nail it this time. They showed up on Sunday afternoon, we hung out, we played games, we watched a movie. I don't remember everything we did, but it was apparently good because no feelings were hurt and we had a good time together. Monday morning I got up, first thing I did is went for a very long run. Because that's what you do with your dog, right? Like the way you get your dog to behave is you work him out, you take him for a long run, and then he's that much better of a dog that day. Does that make sense? I've realized that's why I like to run, because I am that dog, and if I go for a really long run in the morning, then I behave myself all the better throughout the day. So went for an extra long run that morning, got home. Teresa's mom had went to her sister's house, not Teresa's sister, but my mother-in-law's sister lives in the North Valley, and so she was going to go spend the day with her, and my kids were at school, so it was just the 3 of us, like Teresa, her dad, and me. And I'm going, sweet, here we go. Like, I'm ready. I've been preparing myself for this, like pep talking and eating lots of protein and avoiding unhealthy sugars and all the. I was ready for this. First thing we did is we started running some errands, and he used to do some work here, so we took him to some of the offices, and he visited with them, and I hid and kind of stayed out of that way. And then we went and had lunch there's a restaurant Teresa and I like to eat out on Mondays often, and we went and had lunch, and I was kind of teasing him, and we were messing around, we were having a good time, and then I think we did a couple more errands, and then we went to the Blackfoot, and it was all good. Caleb walked in. There's Caleb. We stood there, we sat there, we had a great time, because that's the only time there's not people in there is 2 o'clock. About 3 o'clock, it was time to go get the kids, so we got in the Suburban, we're heading to get the kids, and okay, so this is when it kind of started to go south. What I didn't realize, I don't know if you guys do this, and by guys I mean that literally, because women are such better people. But I had a finish line that was like before the actual finish line. Do you ever do that? Like my best behavior, it was like at 4 o'clock I was going to turn into a pumpkin again, but I didn't know that. Like, because I'm an introvert, I'm a homebody, Mondays are my days off. There's all these things I like to get done at home on Mondays. I wanted to brew that Monday. I wanted to get home. I wanted to do some stuff. And so we went to pick up the kids, and I'm going like, hey, I turned into a pumpkin at 4 o'clock. We're right on time here. It's about 3:15. We'll go home, and I can kind of disappear into my introvert land. They can enjoy the time together. We'll high five in the morning and go on our separate ways. Well, then I learned that we had to go get my mother-in-law from her sister's house. So now we're like, we're short on time here. It's when I started to realize that I had this false finish line. Always gets me in trouble. Do you do this? Does anybody else relate to this? Like, the goal is this time. Yeah, okay, thank you. So you go to Diamond Rio and you can relate to that. Nice work. We're all broken together. Just kidding. So I'm thinking, okay, so we're going to drive to pick up mother-in-law. And in my head, I'm thinking, like, we'll call ahead, I'll slow down to 5 miles an hour. Well, as we drive by, she'll come barreling out of the house. She'll dive into the back of the Suburban, and I'll do a U-turn, and we'll still make it home by 4 o'clock. Needless to say, there was no, 5 mile an hour drive-by. That wasn't going to happen. So I pull into the driveway, and man, I know you'll relate with me on this one. Like, it's a big commitment to go from drive to park, isn't it? Like, that's a big, so I'm thinking foot on the brake, honk, honk, mother-in-law's looking out the window, because I'm not quite ready to move from drive to park. Didn't happen. So I reluctantly put it in park. And there's this terrible thing that auto dealers or auto manufacturers started doing. When you move your car from drive to park, what happens? It's a horrible idea. All the doors unlock, which sends signal to all the children and everyone else. What should they do? They should barrel out of the cars. No, we're not leaving. They're all heading out of the Suburban. So now I've got to make this decision of, okay, so do I sit here while the Suburban's in idle and everybody else is inside? And I had enough sense it wasn't 4 o'clock yet, so I was able to get my wits, and I went inside. And I walk inside, and her uncles, who were like in their 40s, they were playing pinochle. Like, do you want to play pinochle? I don't know how to play pinochle. Do you want us to teach how to play pinochle? I'm going, no, I can't sit down. I'm not leaving the kitchen. Like, we are hovering right here because we're leaving. Like, the point was to walk inside and high five and leave, right? Next thing that happens, the sister pulls out fresh baked chocolate chip cookies. Totally manipulative with small children in the room. So the next thing I know, my kids are sitting down at the kitchen table with a glass of milk and a cookie. Horrible. Then I look over, and my own wife, who loves me and knows that I turn into a pumpkin at 4 o'clock, I look over, and she's drinking a fresh cup of coffee. Not in a solo to-go cup, like it's in a mug. So, you know what I did? I did one of these. I sat up next to her in the kitchen. I was like, hey, I'm leaving. She's like, you're what? I got to go. Go where? Target. I got to go to Target. You got to go to Target? Yeah, I got to go to Target. And I left. Just left. Just telling you, I'm such a broken man. And everybody like, oh yeah, there's the idiot. I knew it was all a facade. I'm not even into the end of the road, right? And you're already going, oh, what am I doing? I just blew it. That was a lot of work. And then I wasn't going to Target, by the way. I didn't know where I was going. I was just driving at that point. Like, I was 20 minutes from my house, which is where I wanted to go. So I couldn't go there. It was getting close to 5 o'clock. So you people that live in the valley, like, good night. You should drive helicopters. And so it was just chaos. I wasn't 5 minutes down the road, and my wife was calling, going, hey, so we're ready to go. So that's what I mean. When's the last time you bombed? Like, when's the last time you blew it? When's the last time you failed to live up to, and like you read the book, you went to therapy, you listened to the sermon, you were going to church, you shared your heart with somebody, you got well, and then next thing you know, you're yelling at your kids again. Or the next thing you know, you're on that website at 1 o'clock in the morning again. Or next thing you know, like, you're looking at a credit card statement that reminds you that yet again you spent more money than you had. Or once again, you're being really insecure in a relationship and you're getting manipulated. Like, when's the last time, I'm not even talking about God's ideals for you. When's the last time you just failed to live up to your own desires for yourself? See, we started this series on Easter called The Goat Has Left the Building, and what we were talking about there is the significance of Easter. That Jesus was the scapegoat, that now when someone wants to hold your past against you, and someone wants to say, like, this is who you are, you get to go, no. Do you see a goat in the room? Because who I am is not defined by what I've done, but by what Jesus did. Like, who I am is a Christ follower loved. We talked the following week about dependence, and then again about this idea of dependence and accountability. And I think that, like, what is a Christ follower piece, what is the identity, that comes together rather quickly. Paul uses this language of clothing yourselves, which I love because we still wear clothes, which is good. We can relate to the image. But when Paul talked about like, what does it mean to be a Christ follower? One of the images he used is you take off old clothing and you put on new clothing. And I guess the question that I'm asking this morning is, so what happens when you put on new clothing, but by the time you walk into the office, it's covered with ketchup? You know? Like what happens when you fail to live up to who Christ called you to be? Maybe you're here and you're not a Christ follower, you're not a God-fearer. That's okay. Because I think there's a unique challenge for you to wrestle with and consider on this one. C.S. Lewis talked about this years ago. But you could sit down and create a completely arbitrary list of things you're going to do, the type of person you're going to be. And I'll bet, even though you're the author of the list, you can't get very many days removed from the creation of the list, and you can't even live up to your own list, which creates a problem. Like it's not just a Christian thing, it's a person thing. Like we live in a Western, democratic, capitalistic culture. That's what we do, is we form identity through what we purchase and what we consume. That's like everything from where you go to what you eat to what you don't eat to where you shop and where you don't shop and what you drive, all of it. It's about identity construction. So what happens when you fall short of your own standards for yourself? That's the question that I want to ask this morning. Because if we don't, I guess where this morning is born out of is if we don't, then Easter was just a big rah-rah. And we return to that same broken place, that same place where we're covered in ketchup and we don't know what to do with it, and either pretend like it's not there or we run away from the whole equation. What do we do? Sociologists, most notably a woman named Brene Brown, you should read everything that she's written. She's incredible. As well as psychologists, all the ish people who don't get their degrees out of Cracker Jack boxes like I do, but like graduate with debt and lots of training. What they talk about is that there's some really predictable behaviors that people exhibit when they fail. Like that when you fall short of your own desires, you could say it this way, there are some really predictable ways that people respond to shame, to how they fall short of their own standards. One of the most predictable is, well, so see what you do when you form identity is, maybe you're an artist. You think of it like painting a picture. Or maybe you have this idea, maybe you're in business, maybe you've got this presentation to give, maybe you're in school and you've got to give this lecture, maybe you're an athlete. See, what happens is you get to the point where you've got a ship, right? You get to the point where you've got to lift the veil off of the painting. You get to the point where you've got to perform. And suddenly you're struck by the fact that that's not a very good sermon you have ready. Suddenly you're struck by the fact that that picture's ugly, or maybe even worse, you get feedback that you're not good enough. What do you do then? See, what psychologists and sociologists tell us is that one of the things you do is, if you're not careful, you just form the opinion that you can't change. Because see, you can deal with failure a little bit. Like if you don't make the 6th grade basketball team, you might go out for the 7th grade basketball team. But if you don't make the 7th grade basketball team, you're probably not going to go out for the 8th grade basketball team. And if you don't make the 8th grade basketball team, then, only the most valiant of people are going to try their freshman year, right? So what do you do when you fall short? And what they tell us is, well, oftentimes what happens is you quit. And if you're not careful, you come to the conclusion that you're not capable of changing, that you are who you are. And one of the things that has really stood out to me this week is I wonder how many of you, and even more so, how many of the people that we do life with, like their issue with Jesus isn't the cross. It's not the historicity of the resurrection. It's not whether or not those were real things. I wonder how many people that we do life with, and maybe this is you, like the issue is they tried it and they couldn't live up to it and they quit. And they'd probably never tell you that. Like we come up with these big flowery intellectual arguments for why they stopped following Jesus. I had a guy come up to me after the last gathering. It's totally a story. Wife left him a year ago. And he's finally realizing, like, no, I just quit. It's the only thing I knew to do is, because how do I look at myself in the mirror and see this ideal and recognize that I'm not measuring up to the ideal? And when you do that, you become the grand master of your own pity party. No one feels more sorry for you than you. And yet you didn't know you had other options. See, part of what happens is a few weeks removed from Easter is the emotion of the goat has left the building, the high priest is sitting down, it goes away, and then you're stuck with yourself. And yourself is a really bad son-in-law. And so you got to know how to reconcile that. The other really common thing that the gists tell us, the medical professional people tell us, is that if you don't do that, the next most common thing is you just lower the standard. You just push it down. And you say, well, everybody yells at their kids. 75% of the population, men and women, well, it's a little bit lower for women, look at pornography. Like, everybody looks at pornography. Everybody's insecure. Everybody spends more than they make. And you just lower the bar. And yet where that gets tricky is pretty soon you don't even know what you stand for other than you, which gets kind of gross and messy. The third option, and this one, it's so fascinating. Jesus was such a gracious person. And yet with the people who fall into this third category, he wasn't all that gracious with them. He was pretty harsh with them. Because the third option, and I'm sure that you've done this on occasion, maybe you don't live there, but I'm sure you've done it before. The third option is you just convince yourself that you do measure up. You ever have this, like you have this dumb moment with your wife, and like there's one simple explanation for what happened. It's called you're an idiot, but you lay awake at night and you spend like the next 3 days constructing an argument for like why you weren't at fault, they're at fault. But never mind that it takes 72 hours to form the argument and 67 steps. This one only takes 1 step. This one's a big, complicated explanation. But do you ever do that where you can just form this argument that says like, no, I met the grade. The problem was if they wouldn't have done that, I would have made it. Have you ever met anybody, or maybe you know somebody who just can't receive criticism? Like every time you offer it, it turns on you. I used to get mad when I interacted with people like that. I now get very, very sad. Because what I realize is that they're the type of person who thinks that the only way they can have value and the only way they can exist in the world is to have no faults, which frankly isn't even humanly possible. You ever find yourself there? Listen, I don't know what your conclusions are about Jesus, but this was one of those weeks where I was super, super excited for the content, though I wasn't very sure about the presenter, because I'm convinced that what we're talking about here, as we look at the other offer, the other option that Jesus brings to the table, I think is one of the most often missed and yet most crucial things for us to understand about Jesus. Because Jesus, he goes, it's not A, it's not B, it's not C, it's D. He constantly gives us this other option. And I think one of the ways you could just boil it down is to say this: Jesus, this wording didn't originate with me, but I loved it when I heard it. It was Andy Stanley was the first one to say it. I heard him say it a couple years ago. But here's what Jesus constantly did. Jesus knew that there was an ideal, and he knew that there's what's real, and he knew that there would always be a tension between those two things. He knew that there was an ideal, and he knew that there's what's real, and he always knew that there's a gap in between those things. And that to follow God, to follow Jesus, to be a mentally healthy person, I think you could say, is to navigate that tension, not to solve it, not to simplify it, but to recognize as a parent, as a spouse, as an employer, as a leader, as a student, as whatever it is, that there's always going to be an ideal, and there's always going to be what's real. And life demands that you navigate those two things. You know where this has come up for me, and this whole thought process has helped me so much, is there's one particularly haunting issue for me as a parent. I have 3 little boys, 4th grade, 2nd grade, and 1st grade. And I don't think of myself as a super conservative person, but you know what? If something makes me lose sleep as I think about the boys getting older and getting into high school, you know what it is? It's the sexual world that they're going to inherit. I know that makes me sound like another evangelical on a soapbox, but it's not even from a moralistic standpoint. My oldest has some friends who watch How I Met Your Mother, and he's like, could I watch that? And so Teresa and I are like, well, we'll watch an episode. And again, I'm not trying to rail against culture, but it was so typified what terrifies me as a parent, because the message was that what's sexually satisfying is lots of partners and promiscuity without commitment. And this isn't even a Christian conversation. Like, people who deny God would be the first ones to say that all the research, all the data would say the most sexually satisfied people on the planet are people who are in monogamous, committed relationships. There's been studies done. The way sitcoms portray sex is that people who date and are promiscuous, they're sexually satisfied, and people who are married are bored. The reverse is 100% true. People who are sleeping around are deeply dissatisfied. This is like, you say this to your kids and they're like, gross, like you've been married for 12 years. Blah, don't say that. But it's the scientific reality. And what terrifies me as a parent is, and there was a presenter I heard in Nashville a few years ago that's really helped me, and we're going to try to actually get her to town here in this next year. She's a professor who's studying what they call hookup culture. And what's helped me with this wording is, like, I want to teach my kids the ideal. I believe it. I'm not even going to teach it to them because I think it makes them more lovable by God. I just want them to know, like, this is how, like, sex is great and this is how it works best. And yet I also, like, how do I parent them should they go with what's real? Because listen, if they choose to go to Helena High and not be sexually active, I don't know, are they among 10% of juniors and seniors? I would guess it's about that low. And how do I somehow communicate love and acceptance and the best to them, while at the same time not compromising what I think is true? Like, this is tough stuff, right? And what we see with Jesus is time and time and time again, he teaches what's ideal. And then here, if you get this one, I really think, and I say this because I'm a plagiarist, if you get this one, I think the morning was worth it. He always taught the ideal, and yet he never condemned people who failed to live up to it. That's the tension that Jesus lived. That's why for 2,000 years people have been attracted to Jesus, because he wasn't spineless. He stood for something, and yet when people didn't measure up to what he said was God's best, he didn't condemn them. He somehow was able to communicate love to them. In fact, Jesus always taught the ideal. You could say, I mean, think of it. You can just kind of hear this phrase in your head that he was constantly saying, the kingdom of heaven is like, the kingdom of heaven is like, the kingdom of heaven is like. And whenever he taught about the ideal, he actually had a habit of raising the bar on the ideal, not lowering it. I mean, in first century Judaism, everybody knew what adultery was. It was when a married person, or when someone commits a sexual act with someone that's not their spouse. And Jesus went like, no, I don't think so. In Matthew 5, and I mean, if you read 3 chapters of the Bible ever in your life, make it Matthew 4, 5, 6, and 7. I didn't do well in math. I went to Laurel. But you've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Jesus goes like, adultery? That's not like the physical act. Like, it's the thought, which means every man in this room is an adulterer, and probably every woman too, but I'll let you speak for yourselves. He doesn't lower the bar. He raises it. You think of murder. Everybody knew what murder was in the first century, just like we do today. And Jesus goes, no, I think you're missing it. You've heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in the dangers of the fires of hell. It's not a lower bar. It's a higher bar. And you go like, oh, wow, this is tough. What do we do now? And Jesus goes, oh, well, I'll forgive you. What do you mean? Well, because, see, what Jesus taught is as the ideal gets higher, grace becomes more deep. As the ideal gets higher, grace becomes more authentic and more necessary. He told a story about 2 people. One was forgiven a couple million and the other a couple bucks. And he's like, to these self-righteous, religious, powerful people, so which one's going to show more gratitude? And they're like, well, the one that was forgiven a couple million. Jesus, he taught the ideal, and yet he was very aware of what was real. And what makes his life so beautiful was he lived in the tension of that. He understood the gap of that. And this, dare I say, and this again could sound pretentious because I don't for a second think that Narrate's perfect or that we're the only church ever that's ever nailed this, but this, quite literally, this is where you can divide the last 2,000 years of church history. Because one group goes, it's all about the ideal. It's all, and we use words like biblical and these empty words like conservative. And what does it mean? We're going to hold ourselves to a standard. Can't meet it. We're going to hold ourselves to it. We're going to talk about our problems, their problems, not our problems. And it's all under the banner of righteousness. And they're right. Jesus was all about the ideal. And the other side goes, no. God is love. The goat has left the building. The high priest is seated. Like, God is grace. No one sin is greater than the other. God is constantly in relationship with people who are committing sin. Like, no. It's all about God is love. God is accepting. What are they saying? It's all about what's real. See, I would argue this and this is easy because this is formulaic. You can sit down and you can form a constitution. You would never call it that. You can sit down, you can form your list, you can come to your opinions, you can come to your conclusions, and you can engage in the answers to the problems of life, of parenting, of marriage, of living in community with people. You can answer all them without any relationship with anybody because you've pre-decided, no, it's always about the ideal, or no, it's always about what's real. This is hard. This takes relationship. This, when you're looking at someone in sin, there's not a smile on your face because you're right. There's a tear in your eye because they're broken. Here, this is relational. Here is where you have to have relationship with God because you don't get to follow a formula. You're following an invisible, though you say living God who moment by moment and situation by situation walks you through this. Here, you're present with people in their pain. You're present with them in their stuff. And this is where Jesus lived, and I would argue this is what made his life so remarkable. There's one particular place where you could go to a million, but the one that stood out to me this week was in John chapter 8. And some of you will be familiar with this story, but there's this woman who'd been caught in the act of adultery as kind of the precursor to the text. And what's interesting is she was caught in the act of adultery, but they only have her, which tells you something about the society they lived in and the way men rolled versus the way women rolled. And I think the way Jesus elevated women in a way that was way before his time. But they bring this woman who's caught in the act of adultery, and the powerful people who are threatened by Jesus, they're losing their power because of him. They just want to deal with the problem, and this is a trap. Because what they say to Jesus is, what should we do to her? And see, what the law of Moses said was she should be stoned to death. Not like big bong, like rocks, okay? Don't confuse those two things. Take you a minute to catch that one up. And what the law, but what Rome said was you don't have the right to kill her. In fact, so they had Jesus at a quandary, because if he said we should stone her, then Caesar would be threatened and he would get taken out. Never mind that that's kind of what he's shooting for, but that was their thinking. But if he says, well, you can't kill her, then that proves that he couldn't possibly be the Messiah, because the Messiah would never disobey Moses. So there's a tension. There's an ideal, and there's what's real. Do you remember what Jesus did? I wish I could remember this more often when I was dealing with scenarios. Basically, he asked a question. Because what he said was, hey, if any of you is without sin, then by all means, throw a stone. Checkmate. And then remember, he stooped down into the dirt. And we don't even really know what he was doing. Maybe killing ants. Stoops down, and remember, eventually everybody's gone. And when he realizes everybody's gone, he stood up. And he said, woman, which wasn't disrespectful in their culture, where are they? Has no one condemned you? And she said, no one, sir. And then do you remember what he said? He said, then neither do I condemn you. What's real? So go on, go about your ways, no sweat. Don't sweat the small stuff. It's a good occupation you have. No, what's he say? And leave your life of sin. There's what's real. And there's an ideal. And Jesus stepped right into the middle of it and said, this is what it means to walk with a living God. It's not formulas. It's not predetermined answers. It's stepping into the situation. See, what the text tells us is that you are an image bearer of God. See, the text is not anti-power. The text is pro you having power. The power that you have by being a Christ follower, by being a human being, was intended to come to you from God. And the power is you get to make decisions. You get to navigate scenarios like this. God didn't want to give you a formula. He wanted you to be connected with him and connected with others and to make discerning, difficult, messy decisions. And so my question to you is, as you deal with your own brokenness, as you deal with your own aspirations, as you continue to construct your identity, whether it's a Christian identity or not, how are you going to account for the times that you let yourself down? That's the question. because you can quit. And in lots of areas of life, you can get away with it. You can get a different major, you can pick up a different sport, you can find a different hobby, you can move to a different town, you can even find a different relationship. But on the heart level, on the who am I and who do I care to be in this world, you don't just get to quit. Well, you can, but there's not like another town to go to. You're stuck with you. You can quit, and you can quit because you're convinced that there are no answers. And Jesus goes, no, there's an answer. It's called I'll forgive you. You can lower the bar, and I think, quite frankly, this is the one that those of us who are part of this movement, this is what we're most prone to. God's kind of chill. He's our homeboy. Never mind that people in the text didn't dare go before him. Never mind that people who touched the Ark of the Covenant died because of his holiness. We'll just lower the bar. I know this is the one where I'm most susceptible. Or we can convince ourselves that we made it, that we've arrived, and therefore that everyone who doesn't think like us and act like us and solve problems like us, they're the problem. And Jesus goes, no. I would invite you to step into a world where there's what's ideal and there's what's real and there's a Holy Spirit who walks with you and through that. There's the people of God. Listen, even if you're not a Christ follower, we come back to that original question. That even if you don't believe in what you might call God's arbitrary commands, you still have to deal with the fact of how do you deal with the fact that you can't measure up to your own? Like, grace isn't just a Christian thing. Grace is a human thing. And if you don't learn grace, then you really just have a few options. You can become self-righteous. You can completely lose yourself and only be about you because you don't have any standards. Or you can become depressed and completely sickened by the sight of yourself. Or you can understand a God who says, hey. There's an ideal, and the only person that meets it is my son. And I came to walk with you. And as we'll finish up the series next week, the tension is there's the already and there's the not yet. There's who you are because of the cross and how God sees you now, and there's who you are today. And that involves a daily ritual of getting up and seeking God's forgiveness and dusting yourself off and stepping back into his power and your effort in order to become the person that God's calling you to be. And finally, I think the question is, what kind of people are we going to be in this community? Are we going to be the type that's all about the ideal? People can count on us to give them the quote-unquote biblical answer. People know, like, if you bring it up to them, they're gonna call you on your stuff. I think the one we're more prone to is over here. Anything goes. God is love. I would say we didn't do Ales for Trails because we're some kind of radical Christ followers who want to prove that we answer to no one and we can do whatever we want. It could easily look like that. We engage in Helena Ales for Trails because we recognize there's an ideal and there's what's real, and God begs us to step into the culture and be conduits of his grace and his righteousness. Jesus, when he was gone, his guys were writing books. We know them as the Gospels, and they were trying to go like, okay, so how do we explain Jesus? And you know what they said? He was full of grace and truth. Not grace, not truth. Grace and truth.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.